Our next presentation is going to explore the need for artificial intelligence on megaprojects, especially overcoming the complexity with technology. And Dr. Atif Ansar is the founding director of the University of Oxford's Sustainable Capital Intensive Industries and senior fellow for mega project management at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. That's quite a title. It's 4 lines long on my page here. And he has agreed to join us. We're eager to hear what he has to say. Obviously, technology can be daunting. I think you heard Greg Fox talk about some challenges that they have with more senior folks even, and very simple tasks. So hopefully to peel this onion a little bit and to help us, let's welcome Dr. Ansar to the stage. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. My name is Atif Ansar, and I've come here all the way from Oxford to share with you why mega projects need AI and how can you cut through complexity with technology. To get us started, first of all, a very warm welcome all the way from Oxford. It's the best university in the world. Cambridge came in second. Well done to them. But jokes aside, and without modesty, Oxford is phenomenal at what it does as a university. To give you an example, it's the only university that produced a COVID vaccine. And in many areas, it's #1 in terms of our research, our teaching, number of patents that we publish each year. And that's true also for the faculty of major and mega projects, of which I'm part of that faculty as well. We've been going for about 15 years, founded by British Telecom as a way of improving outcomes of very complex capital projects, which I look forward to sharing with you. So a bit about myself. I wear 2 hats. Apart from my role as a professor at Oxford, I'm also a co-founder of a tech company called Foresight Works, and we're partnered with a number of very large enterprise, and grateful to Jim Ellis for the very kind invitation here as well. Alongside that role, I also advise boards of large Fortune 500 companies, including government sector organizations like the World Bank. And I'll touch on that a little bit as well. Just a little plug for those interested in education. I was intrigued by what the panel was talking about. These are the courses we run at Oxford. They are scholarships specially for women. So if you are a female professional in the area, please do get in touch. The MSc in Major Program Management is sort of like an executive master's that I directed for about 5 years. And the Major Projects Leadership Academy is a course for senior civil servants in the UK that's required for everybody managing a mega project on behalf of the UK government. And that's models now been copied in Australia as well as Hong Kong. And we're in conversations as well with the government of the US and Canada. So I'll be sharing and summarizing a lot of this work that's happened at the university as well as my own work in this talk. So let's get into it. The agenda today is I'm going to talk about the 3 C's of major and mega projects. What are the challenges they face? What are some of the causes of those challenges, centering on complexity? And finally, what are some of the cures? And I'll touch on artificial intelligence as that one of the solutions in your toolkit to try and bring these mega projects on time and on budget. So what are major mega projects? This is a picture of Senator Norris looking at the Norris Dam, one of the New Deal dams built in the 1930s. Major mega projects are iconic projects that are transformational for the companies and countries that build them. So anywhere from the US National Highway in the 1950s to the New Deal dams to the big data center build or the semiconductor fabs or life science facilities, these are all varieties of major mega projects. And it's a huge market. It's a $6 to $9 trillion start each year. And even in this space, the chips, the cables, essentially the building, everything that's powered this community has had an involvement of a mega project in how the power got here, how the water got here. So they're sort of silent servants of human welfare that are providing these essential goods to society but they're also very difficult to deliver, as we'll see later on. But they cover really a vast area, from rail to data centers to water projects to big science to weapon systems and what have you. The opportunity is tremendous. This is Hong Kong. I'm sure many of you have been there. Hong Kong in the 1970s was a sleepy village. Hong Kong today is a phenomenally prosperous place. Every single pixel on that picture of a more recent vintage is a mega project. The International Financial Center or any of those towers are multi-hundred million or upwards of billion-dollar projects. Same is true of Singapore. So complete transformation from a sleepy port in 1970s to one of the busiest, most prosperous cities in the world today. And I could show you loads and loads of pictures from cities far and wide, including, of course, in the US. And these mega projects are essential to nation building. So Hoover Dam or the Interstate Highway are just two examples of how the US has leapfrogged in terms of prosperity in the 20th and 21st century off the back of these projects. But they're also civilization defining. So man's landing on the moon, potentially going to Mars. These are ways in which human society is shaped. And Victor Smil, a sociologist, talks about it's humanity's war on space and time. So it's our ability to find greater freedom by being able to bridge great distances and being able to see further and further into the future, hence my interest in foresight. But let's talk about these challenges. I've sort of told you about the amazing potential these projects have, both from a societal welfare perspective, as well as the business opportunities they present because of the large dollar spend, but these projects aren't easy. And you all know this very well. My journey in this began after college. I went to Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And immediately upon graduation, I went to worked at the World Bank in D.C. as well. And as you're aware, the World Bank finances projects in developing countries. Many of them are major mega projects in roads and dams and essential power infrastructure. And all of these projects were not going that great. So I'd ask my boss very awkward questions about, Julie, this project that we finance is running over budget or is running horribly late. What are we doing about this? And she slapped my wrist and goes, shush, don't ask these awkward questions. It's not going to help your career. But being a young neophyte that I was, I kept being very pesky, and then eventually 3 years later went to Oxford to start my PhD in the area, and then built the world's largest data set with colleagues that tracks final investment decision estimates of cost and time against their outturn outcomes at full commercial operation. So really zeroing in on the construction phase of these projects. And this is the variance that we document. This is a data set for nearly 6,000 mega projects from around the world. And as you're very familiar, cost overruns and time overruns are a bit like maternal love. No matter where you are in the world, projects experience them. And that can really impair their overall value creation. So although they're very compelling in terms of an opportunity, unless they're done right, they can also bankrupt your company or create a lot of sovereign debt. So one has to sort of handle them with great care and with great professionalism. So the first takeaway is major projects are hard to deliver. And actually, as we'll see later on, as the world becomes more complex, a lot of things that were smaller projects, like $50 million projects, are beginning to behave a little bit like these very big mega projects as well. And I'll touch on that, of how this complexity is actually coming in at much smaller levels as well. Please feel free to raise any questions as I go along. On top of the double whammy of cost and time overruns is the issue of benefit shortfalls. So if you're not careful, you may not also get the revenue that you're expecting out of it. So that sort of got my interest into how do we solve this problem. Now, what this chart is showing is an excerpt from my data set on big dams, and it goes all the way back to the 1930s, when a variety of dams were built by the TVA, who I believe are in the room, and they were really good dams. They were built on time, very quickly, and are still supplying electricity to date. So as you can see, the red line is the line of being on budget. Anything below on that red line is under budget. Anything above the red line is over budget. There's one very unlucky dam with 50 times budget in Yugoslavia during the war period there. But as you can see, the blue line is the line of best fit. So on average, since the 1930s, dams have doubled their initial budget. And if you can also see, the line is flat. So what that suggests is that we're not, as an industry, as professionals, necessarily learning how to get better at dam building. Now, dams are archetypical mega projects. They should be easy to build. Beavers build dams. We've been building dams for 5,000 years. But despite multiple technological revolutions, this hasn't changed. And as somebody tried to explain to me, they came from a tunneling industry, an Austrian general contractor, and they said, look, now we can build the civil portion of the tunnel just fine. But because we put so much technology, ventilation systems, new forms of security and safety systems, the complexities become so great that we get overruns in other areas that we didn't even expect. So that was their way of saying, look, we're learning, but complexity catches up with us until a point that we have a blind spot elsewhere. So which is why you're seeing this steady state of a double overrun, but it's maybe coming from different sources, which is sort of the point here. So, because many of you are practitioners, don't take it the wrong way, but experience of mega projects is not the same thing as expertise in mega projects. So just because somebody's done a mega projects for 30 years doesn't mean they're any good at it. To be good at it requires being able to deliver these things on time and on budget every time. So it's a very stringent threshold that I'm setting for you, but that, you'd expect that of an Oxford professor. It's hard to get an A. So the takeaway, too, is as a profession, we seem not to be learning as we are building more and more projects. And I'm going to touch on how artificial intelligence is a way for you to learn in a structured way. So machine learning helps you learn in a better way as a human being as well. Very, very similar processes. This is another chart. This one is on European railways. Each one of them is a large passenger rail project. And on the x-axis is cost overrun. So ratio 1 means on budget. Anything above 1 is a cost overrun. And the y-axis is traffic shortfall. So that's first-year passenger numbers. On 1 means the passenger targets were met. Below 1 means that you had a shortfall of number of people who turned up. And we've given it a very generous bullseye target around on budget and on revenue. And as you can see, not a single project falls in that very generous bullseye. Majority of projects fall in the disaster zone of costing too much and not generating enough revenue. So that's sort of the erosion of value that we are talking about. And it's not just true for public sector projects like dams and rail, but it's also true for oil and gas projects where the number of barrels you might extract from an oil field may be far lower than you anticipated to get the business case over the line. So it's a fairly pervasive problem across the industries, which is what we're trying to overcome together. So the status quo at the moment is over time, over budget, under benefits, over and over again. And our work together, which is why we're so excited to be at Curd, is to deliver on time, on budget, to benefits, every time because of foresight and our partners. So delighted to be working with Kurt and yourselves towards that vision together. Now, how do we get there? To understand that, we need to understand the root causes. What is causing these issues to begin with? And I'm going to take a slight detour and talk to you a little bit about psychology. How many of you have seen this line, these two pair of lines before? So if I asked you which of the two lines is longer, almost everybody would say, hey, they're equal. And you'd say that because you've experienced this optical illusion in the past. But even having seen this optical illusion before, you cannot help but notice that the lower line is longer. In fact, the man who designed it Mueller-Lyer, even he cannot unsee this. So he would see this being, the lower line being longer, which is why our brains are unable to do the job. We are constrained by our evolutionary wiring to be able to see the world in a certain way, and no amount of information or expertise overrides that. And this line of work won the Nobel Prize in economics, bizarrely, for a psychologist called Daniel Kahneman in 2002. And the essential point of this is measuring is essential to not getting fooled. So the only way of knowing, because I could be lying to you and I could have deliberately made the lower line longer, the only way to not get fooled is to take a foot ruler and measure it. And that's where data and computers come in play as a constant yardstick to assist the human being. So the ultimate judgment still rests with the human beings, but the computers help you to measure in a more systematic, dispassionate way to overcome these biases. Now, the biggest bias of that is what's presented in this picture, a cat looking at itself in the mirror and seeing a lion with a fully grown mane and a tremendous roar. And in more technical lingo, that's called optimism bias. So the only way we get out of bed in the mornings is to have that optimism about the future, that our project will have an underrun, that our project will meet its budget, will meet the milestones, will be ops ready by a certain date. But in reality, of course, there's a little bit of an optimism bias in that. Now, I have a little bit of a sobering message here that in our endeavors, the biggest risk is ourselves. There is no risk that exists outside yourself because the biggest risk is you. It's not so much that you experience some force majeure issue in the outside world that caused your project to delay, is that we underestimated the time before we set out. And there's enough, particularly if you're building repeatable projects, like data centers, like oil and gas projects, there's enough data out there for you to, like an insurance company would, measure the amount of risk you face to price that risk in right up front. So that's the not learning piece that I was talking about from the dams. Excuse me. Now, an example of that optimism bias is, I'll just quickly illustrate that with an example. Imagine you're building 100 data centers, all taking 2 years, 24 months. So you have a probability distribution that's completely flat, just a vertical line around those 24 months. In reality, some of these data centers will come in a little early, some will slip a little bit over time, and you have a few hairballs that delay for a long time. So the underlying distribution ends up looking like this red squiggly line. Some coming in early, some a little late, and a few running really late. In statistics, we call that a long and fat tail. There's a lot of risk. And the end result of that is that it pushes the average from 24 months to 36 months. This is a completely hypothetical example, but if you ask people in the room, they'll tell you how close this lands to the empirical reality. So this is sort of an example of how, irrespective of the risk they're causing it, of how optimism bias causes that drift in mega projects. As I mentioned, there's one Professor Kahneman in Nobel Prize, and if you have time, please do read Thinking Fast and Slow. It's an outstanding book and sort of a compilation of his life's work in conjunction with Amos Tversky. Now, this optimism bias also has an organizational dimension. So inside organizations, it tends to get worse if companies and organizations are not careful. An example of that is the Challenger disaster, and Richard Feynman has a phenomenal report on this that he worked on with the Congress to produce why the Challenger disaster took place. It killed nearly 11 astronauts. And one of the things he found is that people on the front line knew that the risk from looking at past data was as high as 1 in 50 of a blow-up. But because the then director of NASA was really keen to launch, as that risk was reported upwards, it was diluted at each hierarchical level of the company up until the time that it got to the desk of the director and had been diluted to 1 in 100,000. So the overall underestimation of the risk was 2,000 times. So it's not that the organization didn't know. It's just that from a sensory cognitive perspective, the hand was not talking to the brain, or the brain chose to deceive itself in order to take on a risk that was exaggerated. So just to be mindful that in organizations, optimism bias can take on a political, economic color as well. But I want to talk a bit more about complexity. This is a visual illustration of a schedule of a nuclear power plant. In mathematics, it's known as a directed acyclic graph. You probably call it a precedence network. Each dot represents an activity. It's a task-dependent activity or a milestone in the power plant. And the various colors like green or red represent various forms of relationships between these activities. And as you can see, this is tremendously complex. It's as complex as a weather system or an ecosystem. And because of that interdependency, it's prone to very similar characteristics like a weather system. So where small amounts of disturbance in one part of the system can percolate through the entire network in ways that are very hard to predict for the human mind, because the human mind typically thinks in linear ways, whereas this complexity works in nonlinear ways. An example of that nonlinearity is a question I often pose to my students at Oxford, in which I ask them, hey, how much time do you think it's going to take you to write a 100-word email, a 1,000-word essay, a 10,000-word master's dissertation, or a 100,000-word PhD dissertation? And as you can see, the scale, the scope of work, if you will, is growing in a linear manner. But the time estimate to achieve that grows in an exponential manner. So you can write 1,000 emails in a week. But even if you're a genius, it's almost impossible to write a PhD in 1 week. And this won a Nobel Prize in Physics for P.W. Anderson. And the basic idea is, as quantities increase, the thing fundamentally changes. Qualities also increase. So a 100,000-word PhD is not the same thing as 1,100 emails. They're qualitatively completely different as well. That's true of megaprojects as well. A billion-dollar megaproject is not the same thing as 100 $10 million projects. It's a qualitatively completely different thing. And as a result, requires managing it in a very, very different way. Now, that complexity exposes these projects to two forms of risk. One risk is known as the black swan risk. How many of you are familiar with black swan risks? Some of you are. The term is coined by Nassim Taleb. And the idea is really outsized risks that are unpredictable when you're going in the arrow of time, but looking back at it seem obvious enough. So like a tsunami hitting a power plant. Nobody predicted it in the arrow of time, but looking back at it, it seems obvious enough. Or the fact that a pandemic may take place. None of us saw it coming, but looking back, of course, it's obvious that a pandemic might hit humanity at one point or another. So these are very large disturbances that cause almost immediate death. And many projects suffer from that, like a famous project in Hong Kong that suffered a black rain incident that caused nearly a 4-year delay on the project and doubling of the budget from $10 billion to $20 billion. Now, a second, more insidious form of risk is death by 1,000 cuts. And these are very, very small disturbances that go unnoticed on a day-to-day basis, but accumulate into very large effects. So it's like starting your activity a day later, finishing 3 days later, not filing the noise management plan on time, not getting that approval done on time. None of them in itself seem all that dramatic. And if you chase up on your team, they may get very annoyed, saying, I'm on it, don't worry about it, it'll get done. But because of the interdependent nature of the network I was showing you, these delays accumulate into large tsunamis of risk. And by the time you actually experience the delay, that's the time you announce a 4-year delay on the project. So it kind of goes it's very hidden until it arrives. When I was younger, I used to be very enamored with black swan risk. I spent a lot of my time researching it. But I suppose as I get older and a bit wiser, it's the death by 1,000 cuts that I worry about more, because it's far more prevalent in projects to essentially getting boiled like a frog. You're just not picking up the signal of where the delay may be coming from until it's too late to do anything about it. And then you just have to announce the delay and work with that, which is a fate many projects face. An example of that is Crossrail in the UK. In 2018, 6 months before opening, a new CEO arrived, and on the second week of his arrival, announced a 4-year delay, because the project just couldn't be finished at that time. And the minute as they were going through the books, that's sort of what they had to do. So how do we get out of this somewhat depressing picture I've painted for you? And it's possible to get out of it. But let me backtrack again and think conceptually about how do you build great delivery organizations. And one of the luxuries of being an academic is you get to go to unusual empirical settings. In my case, I went to a gin distillery in Oxford called the Oxford Artisanal Distillery, the Toad. And as I was touring the place, purely research purposes, I can assure you, I spied on one of their whiteboards a very, very wise statement. And it said, as a reminder to self, which was make gin, sell gin. Make gin, sell gin. So actually that became a basis of a model that I call strategic diligence. And here's the puzzle that I'd like to quickly run through with you, which is imagine 2 gin makers. One's called Ruby, the other's called Indigo. Ruby makes really crummy gins, but blimey, she's good at selling it. Indigo makes pretty good gin, but doesn't know how to sell it. Which of the 2 wins the market? Indistinct noises. So here's how most people think about it. Some people say Ruby because they say, because she's so good at selling it, she's going to win the market and Indigo will go out of business. Now, that may be fine if it's a one-shot event, but eventually people will catch up that Ruby's gin is crummy, so they're going to switch. So single dimension, comparing against single dimensions doesn't work. A second strategy is to add up the numbers, in which case both of them get a score of 10. So you can say, well, actually, they'll end up dividing the market equally. A third strategy is to multiply the numbers, in which case you get 16 for Ruby and 24 for Indigo. And the basic idea there is that Indigo wins the market. And therein lies the key point I want to make to you today. Performance is multiplicative, not additive, or highest strength. And projects are great environments for that, because projects are by essence multi-domain. Safety, quality, cost, time, scope, stakeholder satisfaction. If you get a 0 on any of those dimensions, you get a 0 overall. If you deliver on time, if you deliver on budget, but you had a massive safety incident, 0. So you have to be really mindful of the fact that your performance has to be of an adequate level across the entire board in order to have a successful project. And that's in economics known as the O-ring theory, another Nobel Prize-winning theory by Michael Kremer. And the basic idea is exactly that. Performance is multiplicative, and it has 2 messages. One is ensure that you haven't, as a complex system, that you don't have any glaring weaknesses. Because those really glaring weaknesses are going to be where the risk enters and really fails your project. So that's one way of dealing with complexity. And the second very hopeful message is you don't need to be a world champion in every single dimension in order to win the pot. You just have to be okay. Because 4 times 4 times 4 multiplied together becomes a very large number. You don't need 10 out of 10. Of course, it's great if you could strive for 10 out of 10 on every dimension, but not at the expense of having a fractional score on any one. So you can really proverbially move the needle by looking at data, by documenting where you are extremely weak and where you need to improve your performance the most. So with that in mind, let's observe the iron triangle of megaprojects. I've just put 3 dimensions here. We can make this much more complex, but of physical scope, cost, and time. The key argument I want to advance is that organizations obsess with money, but waste time all of the time. So the one area where almost all projects get a fractional score or even 0 is the time dimension, which is where they really suffer. And not meeting timelines leads to loss of revenue, it leads to liquidated damages, it leads to claims and litigation, it leads to not being able to do new projects. So it becomes a real hamstring holding you back, whereas all the internal audits and all the external audits and costs are not improving your overall score all that much. So as executives, as people genuinely interested in improving your performance, focus more on time, increase your focus on time. One of the interesting features of time is that it cannot be stored, it cannot be moved forward, time loss cannot be regained, and we are particularly biased in its estimation. So even a simple task like going to the grocery store, we tend to underestimate. So I might say, hey, I'll be back in 20 minutes, but in reality, I might be back in 24 minutes, or 30 minutes, or next day. There's really no limit to how delayed I can be. And a final interesting piece about time is that a sufficiently well-produced program absorbs the scope within it. So the nouns become verbs. So purely from a mental map perspective, you can move your scope to time and put benefits or revenues or capability as part of your central focus instead. So the key takeaway is increase your focus on time as a way of improving that cumulative performance. Now, just to sort of think about where does AI come into this? A brilliant thing about time data is that it arrives in a very neat package of a Primavera P6 file or an MS Project file or an Aster Project file. So unlike other forms of data, it's already in a considerably structured format for artificial intelligence engines to consume at scale. So if you have 100,000 Primavera files in your company, your contractors, your supply chain may be submitting you their files on a weekly or monthly basis, the sheer volume of data that's available is phenomenal. And as a result, makes it very easy for AI engines to index that data and find the patterns from it. Now, you may say, well, our schedule is not that great. I'm not too sure about the quality of that schedule. The good news is that AI is designed to deal with fuzzy data. So you don't need perfect data. The assumption is that all data are degrees of rubbish and are being consumed in order to find something out of it, which is how sort of voice recognition models are built or text recognition models are built. So your schedule is the single most important document of record, and kind of the first call to action would be get them organized, get them into a repository of some kind. No matter how bad that data seems to you, it contains gold dust that can improve your efficiency as a business, then to really improve your bottom line. The second piece is that think of it like a partnership between the human expert and quite literally a cold calculating machine. Human beings, and particularly subject matter experts, are great at contextual knowledge. They're great at parsimonious heuristics to find the problem just by looking at something very, very quickly. And we're very good at forming intuition. But those intuitive judgments also have systematic biases in them. It's just a given, no matter who you are or how much experience you have. It's just our evolutionary makeup. Machines, on the other hand, have a very large working memory, so they can hold a lot of data in their memories, unlike human beings who have limited bandwidth. And they can perform calculations at scale and at speed. So whereas one planning manager may be able to review one Primavera file in half an hour, the machine can do 1 million in the same time and do it consistently every single time. So there isn't, just because they didn't have lunch doesn't really feature into their calculation process. So think of it like a symbiosis. So last few minutes on how can AI improve project performance. Because it's a talk about AI and because I'm an academic, I'm going to put up an equation on the board. And I promise it's an easy equation to understand. So we talked about performance. Your project performance P is a function of the quality of your planning multiplied with the quality of your execution. So if your planning is great, but your execution is appalling, you get a score of 0. If you have the best practitioners with tremendous execution, but your planning is appalling, you get a score of 0. But if your planning is okay and you're reasonably diligent at your execution, you get amazing performance. And the overall constraining factor is an underscore or square root of risk. So risk doesn't kill your project, but it diminishes its performance if it goes above a certain threshold. You need a little bit of risk in order to do anything, so assume there's some risk in your projects. Can't eliminate it, but if it goes really high, it will diminish the overall performance. So those are the key levers of value of how to improve your project performance. And you can use AI in that symbiosis with your own expertise and your team's expertise to move each of these levers. So for example, on planning, the area where risk comes in is incorrect durations. If each activity has an incorrect duration, the overall schedule will have an incorrect duration. Another area is logic. Another area is all effort represented in the schedule. So you can use your past historic data in a systematic way to look at, have you represented all the effort in your baseline program? You can even teach the machine to generate that for you. That's the sort of domain of generative AI that many of you have heard about. You can use that, as I'm showing you an example. This uses natural language processing to look at, for any given task or inter-milestone duration, what did you plan for? What's your propensity to delay? So for controls installation, if you plan 13 days on average, you're getting 35 days. You've got to do something about it. So you can separate specific activities where a lot of that risk begins to appear. So you can use AI in planning phase to really improve the quality of planning by specifying a better plan. And because you have as-built data from your past projects, you can really learn from comparing your past baselines against your past as-built data. And our approach there is to, if you go back to the previous data center example I was showing, is once you've formed this empirical distribution, which is in your as-built data, is to then identify ways of cutting the tail of that risk. So really identifying which activities really overran, and then systematically zapping that risk, and then you're ready for trying to compress the total duration. On execution, the adage is that everything leadership pays attention to gets done. But leadership doesn't know what to pay attention to. So you need mechanisms of driving your own bandwidth to focus on the right things. And here again, a machine in its cold calculating logic is able to present to you the key priorities that it has learned from lots and lots of data points that you need to be worrying about. So that's how AI can cut through complexity. And the best way to do it is to present it as an Eisenhower matrix. What is urgent? What is important? And then put that in front of your team on a daily basis. And the role of the machine is to be the sorting engine that sorts things in the right places. Your role then is to execute. The machine can't do the execution. You have to really work on it. So there'll be 1,000 things coming at you, prioritize ruthlessly. And finally, on risk, essentially form better metrics. Existing risk registers tend to be too vague. there's sort of movies of dramatic things that may happen, but they don't really specify when, where, how. So people can't have a meaningful way of treating that risk. On the other hand, you can use artificial intelligence and data to pinpoint really specific risks, which activities in which areas that can store my project, and what do I do about them. It's already present in your data. And in my case, in my work, both with Foresight and at Oxford, we've sort of built the mitigation case as well. So AI tools are amazing for anomaly detection and risk detection. And then you can use as a way of company-wide leadership. So once you begin to fix it in one project, the idea is how do you rinse and repeat across your entire portfolio. So you can use the learning loops of your teams of experts working with artificial intelligence tools to arrive at what Tash was referring to as standardization across the entire portfolio. The projects don't need to be standardized, but there are ways of standardizing those approaches, irrespective of whether there's a sort of a lean or an AWP style flavor to your planning as well. So you can reduce the variability across your portfolio and build a repeatable platform. Last thing is, alongside that technological maturity, you need organizational maturity. Immature organizations oscillate between one extreme to another. So they have these great worries, oh, woe is me, we're never going to be able to get better, or we have everything, there's nobody better than us. All of those are fairly extremist views about your own capability. Forming a very correct view of where you really are is a very helpful cognitive space to be. And starting from there, what are the key areas, going back to my O-ring model, that we need to improve, what data we need to collect, and how do we get better at it. So takeaways, megaprojects face the challenge of time and cost overruns. Cognitive biases and complexities cloud our judgment. Focus on time, and finally, AI helps you improve planning, execution, and risk, which are the key drivers for overall performance. Thank you very much. I'll leave about 15, 20 minutes for Q&A. Look forward to your thoughts. Thank you. Thank
you. What an intriguing presentation, and like the other presentations we've had today, Dr. Ansar, we've got several questions. And let's see here. Just a second. Okay, here we go. First question asks, as the technology complexity becomes greater and greater, as with dams and dam building, are we seeing a linear impact on safety and quality as well?
Really good question. So I think construction industry can be commended on the fact that it's really improved the safety record. So, over the years, it's still comparative to other industries, there's more to do. But it's clear that complexity has an impact on the safety. I think the key aspect of it is how you use the technology. So, safe practices and technology can go hand in hand, and unsafe practices and technology can't yield results. So I think it's ultimately about your safety practices and how you go about it that's the important thing here.
Okay, thank you. Another question says, I assume that you have applied this to a real-life project. Talk to us about the application of your principles to a real-life project and what were the results. Do you have a case study example you could share with?
Absolutely. Let me share two case study examples, one from a really large project and one from a smaller project. So in the case of a really large project, it was a 12-year program, and the CEO of this particular company is a large company that builds capital projects but also has a large operational business at the same time. Everything was hunky-dory, went home on Friday evening. Saturday morning, woke up to headlines across newspapers saying that this particular flagship project that his company was leading had been announced to be 3 years delayed, and nobody had told him this. And the press was clamoring for an interview of what was going on for this particular project. In his kind of style, he accepted to do a press conference later that day without any handle on the facts. And as the journalist grilled him, it very quickly turned out that he didn't have the faintest idea about what was going on. So the board met on Monday. He got fired that day. And sort of quite a big public inquiry ensued. And the basic notion was nobody had any handle on the reality in this particular project. They were producing 256-page reports that took a month-long lag for every month. So by the time the 11-person board met to discuss the project, the data were 2 months old. The data were not reliable, so nobody had stress tested the quality of the data. And they couldn't generate any prediction about where might they end up. So no one had any idea of, okay, we assume we're late, but is this ever going to finish? So they brought us in, and I think they were so desperate at that point, they just rang Oxford and like, hey, can you please help us? Even as a young company, they were very keen at that point to get us involved. And we were able to answer those questions very quickly for them. So one is, how do we generate reports instantaneously? If you have 250 plus major contracts on this multi-billion-dollar job, nobody has the time to even know the progress reporting on each one of those things. Well, actually, your schedule data contains that information. Computers and artificial intelligence can work together to generate that really very quickly. So we were able to, fill in the reporting gaps really quickly, but more importantly, give them a auto-generated delay recovery plan that, other people would have charged them several $7 million to produce. And that's what gave them the confidence of what was an ambitious but realistic, achievable date. So sort of gave them a path, and the line opened last year. In a smaller project, in a data center, so EFC installation, it was a 8-month project. The customer really wanted it done in 6 months. And the reason was not financial per se, it was simply because their customer was going to be furious if it wasn't delivered in 6 months because of just the serious demand for data. So they brought us in, again, to track it, identify where supply chain issues could arise, which activities had lead times. So that led them to complete the project in 6 months. And now they've rolled us out to the entire portfolio.
Interesting.
Thank you.
Pardon me. Another of our audience asks, schedule networks often are a result of just simply poor logic to begin with. Is the best use of AI to detect that poor logic that's being used or improve sound schedule networks, or both? Comment?
Absolutely both. So, it's very much a domain of human and machine working together. Where human beings have indispensable knowledge is the actual subject matter expertise of the sequence with which things ought to be built. And that can't be replaced. To give you an example, we were working on a semiconductor fab, and we saw some of the baseline files, and it scored reasonably high on one of our algorithms, but we had a bit of suspicion that there wasn't something quite right with this file because it's scoring very low in some of the other ones. But it did take a conversation with the customer for us to collectively realize that the contractor had not put any steel in the schedule. So you can't really build a semiconductor fab without steel. So that sort of thing required an expert eye, but where to sort of follow the machine's red flag to then have the confidence to drill into it and then discover these really big things. One final point I want to make is, if you have enough data, and by enough data I mean 5 past projects where you have a good baseline, by a good baseline, I mean a baseline you recognize to be a legitimate baseline. So not an aspirational baseline, but the baseline you were actually building to. And you have a midpoint and an endpoint file. With these 15 files, you can really you can generate the baseline template schedule for that category of a project. So if it's an enterprise data center, or if it's a particular kind of chemical plant, you can get really far really quickly of what sort of activities need to be in there. And then it really makes the process of scheduling expert or planning expert to go through that populated template and correct it with their knowledge or improve it with their knowledge than to start from scratch, which process can take upwards of a year for a mega project.
So does your approach assume many highly similar projects, or what are the prerequisites for the ideal application on a project?
So it's a really good question. Construction is interesting because we do repetitive tasks even in non-similar projects. So there's a crew mobilization in every project. There's a start foundation, there's a complete foundation, there's erect steel, there's cabling, piping, etc. It could be a refinery, it could be a data center, it could be a rail project, etc. So a lot of these basic units, these Lego blocks, repeat themselves over and over again. So part of it is that you can, at a very granular level, get quite a bit of insight irrespective of the kind of project you're working on. For example, we work with the UK Atomic Energy Authority in the UK. They're building a fusion reactor, world's first commercial fusion reactor. The science is still being worked out, but a lot of the kind of platform building, et cetera, is the same as traditional nuclear power. So there's a lot of commonality, much more commonality than meets the eye. So that's one answer. But if you have a really similar, like a 16 megawatt enterprise data center, and you're trying to build 100 of them, our approach would get you to kind of Formula One style precision. So it's really about what you're trying to achieve, and the data, et cetera, is cut according to that.
Thank you for that. Another one question says, things that get measured typically get done. How do you manage the data integrity on the input when users understand what's being measured?
Great stuff. So I think one is kind of checks on the overall quality. So that's the network integrity. And we run a variety of checks that are familiar to you, like dangling activities, invalid forecast dates, et cetera, missing successes, predecessors, et cetera. What we've discovered is that once you get over a certain threshold, so we mark it over a score of 0 to 100, anything below 50 is not something that we like to process. It's just not, in a good enough state. But it contains a little bit of signal. By the time you get to 60, it's as good as you need it to be for an AI to process it and work with it. So one is, work with data that meets a minimum level of adequate quality. Doesn't need to be pristine, but just needs to be okay. So that's one point. The second is the famous critical path method algorithm that DuPont Corporation invented in the 1950s has been very useful, but is also obsolete, unfortunately. So it's giving you a wrong sense of priorities in your project. And with the advent of AI, we've now invented, which is a patented invention, is a new way of doing this. So a new way of prioritizing that doesn't ignore float calculations. But if you think about it, in a complex weather system, there are far more interlinkages than simply distance, which is what float roughly measures. So things that you don't necessarily pay attention to, like a permit or an approval, that doesn't have costs associated with it, doesn't have resources associated with it, is very likely to slip under your radar. So that's the kind of things that a well-trained machine model is able to consistently pick across your portfolio.
Excellent. Construction productivity has been stagnant for over 50 years, as we've all seen and heard. How do you feel the leap in AI, and more so in technology, will give us the boost we need? Part one. Part two of the question is, what's going to be required that in order for this kind of technology that you're promoting to have widespread and pervasive use in our industry?
Great questions. Both of them are great questions. So first of all, I have talked about kind of productivity measures in the past as well. I personally think the bigger thing to focus on is reducing duration. And part of this is that not all tasks in a project have a production rate associated with it. There's no production rate to producing, getting an approval. There's no production rate to getting your red lines over the line or getting acceptance certificates. So there's quite a few tasks inside your project that are binary, that are either done or they're not done. And what our research has shown over and over again is where projects stall is that stuff, is the stuff without a production rate. So trying to hassle people to be faster for doing that doesn't help, but focus on those tasks and getting them over line does. So your assurance documentation, your system integration tasks, your master document list, your permits, approvals, all that sort of stuff. So one is I just want to introduce a little bit of skepticism about productivity, which is that just simply pressing on your contractors to work faster is not the solution. You have to look at the entire network and compress the network. And that, so you gain, so that's why you gain overall project productivity without necessarily pouring concrete any faster than you were pouring before. So that's sort of the first point of it. The second point, which other people mentioned as well, is simply the learning curve of training people. We've all sort of learned project management from textbooks that was written in the 1950s. It takes time to show proof of value, convince people that to work through it with real data in a real life setting. So I think the real challenge to adoption is, in a very pragmatic way of proving value at each step, and for people to experience it themselves, and then it begins to spread like wildfire eventually.
Do you have any allies or alliance partners in your pursuit of the use of AI in construction, particularly in the United States?
So we are, if this is an offer from Kurt to formally partner with us, the answer is yes.
The question came in, I don't know from whom, but yeah, so good.
But we're working with a number of very large American companies, and we'd be delighted to, I'd love spending time in the US, and one of my colleagues, Tom, who's British but lives in LA, so he's got the best of both worlds, is in the room. So we'd love to partner more in the US.
Thank you. Do you require both original and final as-built project schedules as inputs to the AI system in order to generate meaningful and reliable results?
That's the most reliable way to do it. That failing, look, the rule of thumb is any data is better than no data. So even if it's completely, almost the point of being made up, it's still giving you some signal. So the best would be the as-built, the midpoint, and the start point would be a really great set to begin with. In absence of that, just the endpoint tells you a lot. If the endpoint is not available, we'd work with anything you've got to at least kind of get the ball rolling, on proving the value.
Companies have gotten decently good at understanding and sometimes managing risk, but how can they deal with uncertainty? How do you plan for what you cannot predict in your model, such as economic downturns, geopolitical issues, and thinking beyond obvious black swan events?
Really good question. So I think one is there's more it's much easier to model risk than people realize. Actually, the content of uncertainty is lower, particularly for projects that are meant to be under 2 years. I would almost venture to say that for under 3, if your project is under 3 years, most of the risk is modelable. It's really when you start to go into deep uncertainty, which as a rule of thumb, I'd say is beyond 36 months. So there's much more modelable risk than you realize is number one. So work really hard to figure out what that is. Second is, on the uncertainty side of things, is be dynamic. So look at how your project is changing month to month. Inevitably, your program will shift, you will add activities, you delete activities, you'll prune the network, you'll change relationships. That you need to recalculate your risk and uncertainty. And then there's a common sense discussion to have. I mean, I think some of these things are beyond the purview of AI, which is to sort of talk about the broader uncertainties, but to have that culture of like doing a war room, having a weekly discussion around those strategic uncertainties. Where the AI can help is simply draw your attention to the core issues. So you have a limited scope to talk about rather than have a very unstructured discussion about anything that could blow up your project.
In our construction industry, safety is an important factor. Can you comment or provide any specifics concerning the successful use of AI relevant to safety predictability?
Really good question. It's unfortunately outside my area, so I think I shall hold comment on this. I work more on the shadow side of things.
All good. Does your AI learn within a company or across companies?
Really good question. Collaboration is key. The best scenario is when the owner and contractor look at the schedule together in the tool. And if the further down you go, because organizations are like a multi-layer cake as well, the more you're cutting across that vertical boundaries, like I talked about in the Challenger example, people in your companies know stuff. but you're not necessarily processing that. So the more you cut across those vertical boundaries, both inside your organization and across organization boundaries, the more benefit you get.
Similar to the use of big screen TVs when they first came out, or a portable phone when it first came out, how do you view the next generation of AI utilization in our industry?
Look, I think it's, again, a little bit like how we've begun using AI in ways we don't even realize. So, from your basic Google search, to the way we route our maps, to the way you talk to Alexa, or order something on Amazon, or get a recommendation on Netflix. So a lot of AI's value is it's very much like an assistant type variety of helping you in ways in which you don't necessarily even recognize. So it's sort of making your life richer, it's making it more fun, and certainly easier. So part of it is, think of a way, projects are, to the point made in the panel earlier on, extremely stressful environments. So I think the key point here is these are ways to de-stress, a lot of ways to reduce the number of hours you have to work in order to just keep on top of your project. So you can meet those ambitious commitments, but still have time to see your kids.
Terrific. And final question, based on our time, if human subjective beliefs and biases are key to our problem, how can you escape that using technology or AI? It's easy to use data to prove our own biases at times. Thoughts?
So I would say, use the analogy of your spectacles. So think of AI like a corrective lens. So you're doing the seeing, but you need that lens to correct what you're seeing. And if you take them off, you revert to the natural state.
Dr. Ansar, it's been an intriguing presentation. Let's show our appreciation for his coming all the way from the UK across the pond to be with us.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.